In the face of our planetary predicament and the sober data of climate catastrophe, in the face of unprecedented economic inequality and what seem to be endless wars alongside increasing division, racism, and hate, most human beings, even if they're not consciously aware of it, I think, feel overwhelmed. Something inside all of us knows that the precious resources of our soul are being extracted alongside all of the natural resources with which the earth has blessed us. In a time of incalculable loss, the only sane response is deep grief. But we live in an extremely grief-phobic culture that tells us that grief is not important, or that we should be careful to limit the amount of grief that we feel, or that if we feel any grief at all, we might get stuck in it forever. We're told that grieving is weak and that we should keep a stiff upper lip and soldier on. But unlike our culture, many indigenous cultures know that grieving is not weak and that we need it, in fact, and the community needs it. In some indigenous cultures, the community actually provides ongoing rituals that assist people in feeling their grief. These cultures also understand that if we do not express our grief, it becomes toxic to the community, and that when we allow ourselves to grieve, we're not only benefiting ourselves, but the community at large. A beautiful quote was sent to me by someone who attended a weekend grief workshop in which they said, quote, "What people ached to do was to tell the truth of their own experience, tell what they know and feel and see what is happening to our world. And then they found the feelings they feared, and the feelings didn't last, and the feelings turned into relief and a sense of empowering solidarity with others, and they broke out of their self-imposed isolation into energizing collaboration," unquote. When I offer grief workshops, people often ask what kind of grief we'll be addressing in the workshop. Will we be addressing the grief around the death of a loved one? Will we focus on the grief of aging or the grief of losing a relationship? Unfortunately, our culture divides grief into categories just as it divides us from our deepest emotions and therefore from each other. The truth is that all forms of grief are connected. In his must-read book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief, Francis Weller notes what he calls the 5 gates of grief and demonstrates that they are all connected. In the first gate of grief, we recognize that everything we love, we will lose at some point. All relationships will end either in death or in separation or divorce. This is what makes loving another living being very dangerous, at the same time that it's delightful, because ultimately we will lose them. The second gate of grief is grief for the places within ourselves that have not known love. These are parts of ourselves that we've had to send away in order to be accepted by others. It contains our shame and the ways that we've had to carve ourselves up in order to be acceptable and fit into the world. A young man or woman may have grown up hiding his or her attraction to the same gender. Another person had incredible talent as an artist, but his family insisted that he forget about art and take over the family business. Most of us are carrying some grief for the lost pieces of our soul that we've disowned and that need to be reclaimed. The third gate of grief, and one that we're all feeling on some level, is the sorrows of the world. When hundreds of species are going extinct daily, when climate change appears to be destroying our planet, when we witness epidemic violence and war, when we see millions of refugees migrating to other parts of the world in order to be safe, only to die in the process or be killed or rejected in the places they want to resettle, and when we witness the poverty and economic inequality throughout the world within industrial societies, our hearts are broken, perhaps many times daily. The fourth gate of grief is grief for what we expected but did not receive. One of the most damaging losses for people in industrial societies is that, unlike people in indigenous cultures, we've never had a strong, reliable community embracing us in the way that a native village embraces its members. We may have had relatives who supported and cared for us and a variety of loyal friends, but that's not the same as growing up in a village where we feel held and supported 24 hours a day in good times and in times of adversity. The fifth gate of grief is ancestral grief. Although we may assume that the grief and sorrow of our ancestors, that the sorrow that they carried ended with them, the truth is that we carry the grief of our ancestors in our bones. Studies are now indicating that we carry the trauma of previous generations in our DNA. And this certainly seems to suggest that the grief of our ancestors resides within us as well, even if we have only a superficial knowledge of their lives and experiences. As I stated earlier, the 5 gates of grief are connected. We cannot separate them. And if we allow ourselves to grieve about one of the gates, that grief will certainly activate the grief that resides in the other gates. This is why it's important to commit to doing long-term grief work. Because we have so much social conditioning against feeling our grief, it's important to understand what is true about grieving and what is false. First, it's important that we not carry our grief alone. From time to time, we all find ourselves having a good cry by ourselves, but if we commit to doing long-term grief work, we will need support. For this reason, we recommend a container of safe and well-structured grief workshops in which people have the safety and support they need in order to express their grief and not be alone with it. If you're not able to attend a grief workshop, consider life coaching with someone skilled in supporting you in the conscious grieving process. Secondly, despite the fact that we've been told that if we begin grieving, we'll never stop, or that we'll be overwhelmed by our grief if we feel it, the truth is that the body has natural safety mechanisms that keep us from getting overwhelmed, especially if we have a safe container in which to feel our grief. Thirdly, feeling our grief is not weak. It takes great courage to acknowledge and feel our grief, especially in the face of all of the cultural messages to the contrary. Fourthly, when we express our grief, we are expressing love. We only grieve that which we love. And our grief is not only the price of love, but a tribute to the love we carry in our hearts. Rumi said that one of those gifts is joy. And in his poem, The Sweet Taste of Grief, he says, I saw grief drinking a cup of sorrow and called out, it tastes sweet, does it not? You have caught me, grief answered, and you have ruined my business. How can I sell sorrow when you know it's a blessing? When we're willing to consciously grieve with support, we're likely to experience a number of gifts. The first is a profound opening of our hearts that reveals not only our heartbreak, but our love. As a result of grieving, our empathy and our compassion become larger and more expansive. Grieving often allows us to experience a quality of love we didn't even know was possible. Paradoxically, one side effect, one benefit people almost always experience from grieving is an increase in joy. In fact, grief and joy travel together and need each other. The truth is that holding our grief inside and repressing it stifles our joy. When grief is allowed, joy increases. Alongside an increase in joy, we almost always notice an increase in gratitude as a result of grieving. Our willingness to grieve causes us to value what is dear to us and deeply appreciate our lives as opposed to taking them for granted. Conscious grieving enhances our physical and emotional health. In this culture, congestive heart failure is a leading cause of death. So many of our hearts are congested with grief, but conscious grieving frees up a great deal of energy that we may have been using to keep our grief at bay, and this can only support our physical and emotional well-being. Many people who are engaged in conscious grieving report an enhanced feeling of aliveness and vitality as a result of doing grief work. Conscious grieving also enhances our interpersonal relationships. As we feel the compassion that grieving facilitates, as our hearts become more open to ourselves, to each other, and to Earth, we feel and live out our inherent connection with all living beings. Ken Orphan writes in his blog that, quote, "It is in grief that we find ourselves to be inseparable from each other and from nature from which we are all born. In this way, sorrow is the only coherent answer to extinction. It is a wail of conscience," unquote. The American writer William Faulkner said, "Between grief and nothing, I will take grief." By this he meant that perhaps nothing is worse than the empty grayness we feel as a result of repressing our grief. If you would like to learn more about my grief weekend workshops, contact me at my website, www.carolynbaker.net. Together, let's explore grief and its many beautiful, unimagined gifts. My heart welcomes your grief because I need your grief, and we all need each other's grief if we want to heal ourselves and our planet.